Alright, so I am going to show you some of the basic stuff. This isn't going to be comprehensive, most of it's covered in the guide, but this will give you kind of a visual example of what I was explaining about, in particular dealing with MechWarrior Online mechs and kind of prepping them for MechWarrior 5, the actual in-game part, and some of the basics of dealing with Maya, particularly when it comes to like skeletons and stuff like that. So first off, there are a couple of things you want to do. Make sure everything's showing up right. Alright. So, make sure I'm modeling. So one of the key things you want to do with Maya is you want to make sure it's set to Z up, because that's the standard for Unreal. You can do that by going to Windows, Settings, Preferences, and then hitting this little Settings section down here, and hitting Z up and saving it. Now you'll have to do that before you open or import anything, otherwise it will be out of whack. And that's one of the most important things, because if you don't have that set right, all your rotations are going to be different whenever you import either a mech or a skeleton or something like that, and give you a lot of problems. Plus, it's important for your export to make sure everything is, facing the right direction and lined up properly. So, let's go ahead and get a base mech in first. Now in my case, like I said, I've got everything kind of saved out. Okay. Don't mind that. I had a long morning. I was up at like 4 o'clock and I'd spend 3 hours on the road. Alright. Now I'm just doing this all off of memory, so I might miss some things. Base assets, mechs from editor. I'm going to be doing, as far as the MechWarrior Online one goes, the Viper, just because it was one I had already used, already showed you, and I think it should work with the Cataphracts. Let's see. Now, in the case of MechWarrior Online or any other kind of custom mechs and stuff, the actual skeleton you're going to be using is not necessarily going to be the weight of the mech. So sometimes you'll have a situation where like the Cataphract is a heavy, but you might have a light mech, that's using the same body structure. Use the Cataphract, and then just use whatever method Merktech or any of them are using to scale it down. That way you don't have to deal with the animations, because like I said, you cannot rescale the skeleton. If you rescale the skeleton, the animations will get messed up, it'll break everything. If you're unfamiliar in Maya, if you hold Alt and left click, that will rotate your view around. If you hold Alt and middle click and drag, that will pan your view around. And right click and drag is to zoom out. That's just an easy way to kind of like navigate that. And spacebar will switch between your different views. So either it'll solo whatever view you have your mouse over, or it'll go to your 4-panel view. In this case, everything is in shaded mode. I'm hovering my mouse over it, pressing 4 to get a wireframe for all those. It's my preference. F is the focus key. If you hover your mouse over window, press F, it'll basically make sure everything that's in will fit in the screen. So, I'm going to work in perspective for now. Whenever you import a base mech or vanilla mech from MechWarrior 5, you will be given this right here. This in Maya is referred to as a group. A group is not an actual object, it is literally just a group. It's an empty grouping of multiple objects. If you expand it, the root is your skeleton, and the SKM is your actual geometry. They're two separate objects grouped up. When you import that into the MechWarrior 5 editor, it will actually treat it as a singular SKM object. That's kind of how, I guess, Maya handles. I want to say Blender calls it like a component or something like that. I forget exactly what Blender does, but the idea is that in Maya it's a group, and it's treated as a separate object in a separate group. I could take this mesh and separate it by clicking it, holding down middle mouse button, and dragging it out where I want it. You see, I just put it underneath the front camera, so it's been separated. Because it's a group, it's not a component. If you want to make something a component, you would click on it and go to Mesh and Combine. Combine is separated those two things I was talking about when you're prepping the model. But I'll try not to get too far ahead of myself here. Alright, so we got a base mesh, and you want to get the skeleton. First things first, there's a little button over here. It's called X-ray joints. You will probably want that on when dealing with the skeleton. That way you can see your skeleton through the mesh, no matter what. You'll see it kind of looks like a little shooting star icon on the little right side or whatever. Hit that way you got that on. So when separating objects that are bound in Maya, the attributes and stuff are actually on the object itself. So in this case, these are all the applications of this mesh. So everything done to this mesh is here. So you got the SKN, you got its actual shape node, you've got its other shape nodes, like the origin shape node. Skin cluster right here is the actual binding of the mesh to the bones itself. There's some way you can see find out what it's actually bound to. I forget exactly how to do it. But basically, everything is done in the geometry. So for instance, to unbind the geometry from the skeleton, you wouldn't actually click on the root. You would just click on the actual geometry itself. Set to rigging, go to skin, and unbind. Although in this case, I'm going to open this just so you can see. If you hit the little option box, that's what this is. It's called the option box. It'll pop up options for the tools. We'll be using that a little later for binding, because when you're binding mechs, you want to do a solid, like a non-transforming bind, skin bind. You don't want any kind of like flexing. In this case, with unbind, you don't need to do any options, so just unbind skin. Oops, there. So now the skin is completely separated from the actual bones. Now, when working in groups, you'll notice that you can actually move stuff around in the group without affecting everything in the group. But if you move the group, it will affect everything. So, if I remember correctly in the guide, I'm pretty sure I pulled everything out of the groups or ungrouped everything. Because I want to say that when you export the FEX of the root and the SKM together, it creates a group in Unreal when it's imported or something. And if you have a group beforehand, I think it breaks it. Like I said, you'll want to double check the guide. It's very crystal clear, but I'm pretty sure you don't have it grouped up. So in this case, if you want to ungroup stuff, you can either do it individually or you can group, click the actual group itself. That'll highlight all the objects, go to edit, and ungroup. Now everything's ungrouped, they're all separate, there's no more group, all that good stuff. So, channel box. If you need to see your layers and stuff, channel editors over there. And when you want to hide an object, you'll hold Control and press H. That way you can hide it, you don't see it. This is your outliner. This is the outliner button. This will pop up the list of all the objects and stuff in the scene. If it's dark like this, then it's hidden. You can't actually see it. If you need to unhide an object, select it and Shift H. Like I said, you'll probably want to do some tutorials and stuff to get all the details of Maya down. I'm just going to explain some of the basic shortcuts I use as I'm going through. Alright, so I'm going to hide the Cataphract SKM just because I don't really need it. And now we're just left with the skeleton for the Cataphract itself. So the skeleton's as is, you don't want to edit it. If you edit it, it breaks the animations, it breaks the scaling. MechWarrior 5 uses shared skeletons. So, like, they're all shared even though they have different orientations and stuff. It's weird. Skeleton stuff is funky and unreal sometimes. But basically what you want to know is that unless you want to create an entirely new skeleton on your own and create entirely new animations, every single animation, don't mess with the skeleton. Just leave it as is. Try to get your mechs as close as possible to the proportions. And when I say proportions, what I'm talking about is this. So, if we fully expand out the skeleton, if you hold shift and hit the plus or minus, that will expand or collapse all the different nodes within it. Let's see. Let's go. Yeah. Torso, clavicle left. All right. So here's your clavicle. Your upper arm, shoulder, all that kind of stuff. You'll see when I select clavicle, it's highlighting everything down the list because that's all the stuff that is in the hierarchy. I'm sure you know how hierarchies work, so I shouldn't need to explain it. But when I'm talking proportions, where you should know, I'm sure you're familiar, but I'm going to kind of explain it because somebody else doesn't really know and they're looking at this. With proportions, what I'm talking about is ensuring that the part of the model, in this case the actual shoulder itself, where it's supposed to rotate, is going to match up to the location of the bone. Because the location of the bone is your pivot point for whatever geometry is attached to it. It goes the same for the elbow. The lower arm is attached to the elbow. It's just, it's a I guess a engine representation of what exists in reality as far as our leverage and all that kind of stuff goes. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about matching up proportions. I'm talking about trying to get as much of the mech to fit closely to those joints as possible, so that when the animations are playing out, it is not creating weird things where like legs are like coming out of place and shooting way out the side, stuff like that. That's kind of the main goal, and I found that for the most part, you primarily want to focus on the legs. The legs, I think, are kind of the ones that stand out the most. Arms, you won't notice it as much. There are some instances where you'll want to make sure the arms are fairly closely aligned. But I find that legs are the ones that really make the biggest difference because like they're always moving and they're not hidden by the mech's body if you're playing in third person, stuff like that. So that's usually my starting point, is trying to ensure that the legs and everything are kind of set up right. Alright, let's go ahead and hide that. I'm going to go ahead and hide the other skeleton as well. Now let's go import this Viper. If I could remember where I have them. MWO Mech. What was that I was doing? The Viper? So this is what I was talking about. With the MWO Mechs, you'll have a large selection of possible models you can import. So if we go down to all files, you don't have to do this when you're importing. But if you want to set it up so that you only see certain types, DAE FBX is the file type you're going to be working with from the MWO Mechs. And it's just .DAE. DAE is some older thing. I actually forgot what it stands for now. The body, so Viper underscore body, I believe is the one I was primarily working with. You can do render, or even just the regular one, body all possibly. You can look through these and kind of see what different options there are. What different actual options there are. As you can see, there's an enormous amount of stuff. A lot of it's hard points, separate body parts, things like that. In the let's go ahead and open this one and see. Okay, so there's nothing in that. That's just the. Yeah, so it's broken file. Alright. So let's import one of the other ones. And I believe it was this one was the one I primarily used. The mech underscore body.dae. Yeah. All right. So this is the way it comes when you do the D8. Now these will also have skeletons. You'll notice that it doesn't come with a group like the vanilla mechs do for MW5. It'll come as this. So you'll have the actual mesh, and then you'll have a skeleton proxy underneath it. You can actually just delete that. You don't need it. It's not applicable. You're not going to be messing with that kind of stuff. All you need is the mesh. Now, when I was talking about how you can break up the mesh to kind of prepare it for MechWarrior 5, this is where your script isn't going to work, because it's not going to work the same for every mech, and sometimes it's not going to work the same for every model. You're going to have to kind of mess with stuff a little bit. So your goal is to get this as close back to the original form when it was originally modeled as possible. So you've got these big component sections, you know, like the upper arm here, the lower arm here, you know, the calf, the foot, that kind of stuff. Now, the way you do that in Maya is everything here is component. So this has gone into an engine. The engine has processed it and all that kind of stuff. That's why you got a little, you don't have clean quads and all that kind of stuff. And what the engine does is it breaks all those little quads out as separate things themselves. That's not what you want because you can't work with it. The engine likes it, but we don't. So, if you try to use this model as is right now in MechWarrior 5, it won't work because it's a single component object, and even if you skinned it to the skeleton, it would stretch and squash and all that kind of stuff that you don't want to happen because it's a mechanical model. To top that off, everything is broken up into little cubes, so if you were trying to adjust your skin weighting and stuff, it's going to be just a nightmare. But what we can do is we know that all those quads and stuff are broken apart, and we want to re-weld those quads. So it, if you have one vertice that's 4 different quads where they all meet, when it goes in the engine, it creates 4 vertices there, one for each of the quads when it breaks the quads apart. What we want to do is we want to weld that back together, so you go back to having the 4 quads attached to a single vertice. And it's a really simple process. You're just going to go to vertex mode. You'll see all the vertexes here. You're going to highlight them all, every single one of them. You're going to hold shift and right click. You're going to go to merge vertices, and you're going to go to merge vertices and open up the options window. Now, the reason I say open up their options window is because you want to have something like this. A really small threshold, like 0.01, and then always merge for 2 vertices. That's going to ensure that you're only merging vertices that are incredibly close to each other, basically stacked on top of each other, which would be those duplicate vertices. So, once you've got that ensured, you hit merge. It's going to take however long it's going to take. Mine goes pretty quick. You're not going to notice anything different. Now, okay, I'm going to do something quick. Okay, I am going to duplicate this. If you need to duplicate, Control D, and then W to move, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to have 2 different versions here. I'm going to kind of show you what I mean. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and clear transforms on that. I'm going to leave the transforms and stuff the same on the other one. It doesn't really matter. Alright, modeling, mesh, separate. So this is going to take a second because it's going to process a whole bunch of stuff. Now, what I've done is separated. So Maya has said, okay, cool. Well, we have this object that's made up of a whole bunch of different objects, and we're going to break that apart into individual objects. Now, what you'll notice is they're not clean. It's like weird random spots, little sections, little objects. It's not the whole component. So, like, if I use this cylinder as an example, they didn't obviously build a cap and then build a cylinder, body. It was a whole cylinder. The engine broke that apart. Sometimes it can be usable, but most of the time, like in cases of this, where it's like you've got all these different little face sections and stuff that are just going to be an absolute pain in the ass to work with. That's what you don't want, because then you're trying to do all this kind of stuff, and you got like weird little sections like this where it's broken out. Control 1, by the way, is to isolate whatever object you've got selected as the only thing visible, which is what I just did here. Anywho, so you end up with all these little, abnormal sections and stuff, not what you want. You don't want to skip this step if you're dealing with MechWarrior Online mechs, because it's not worth it. So, now the easy way to do it. Vertex, highlight all the vertexes, merge verts. Alright, cool. I'm going to break or do the transforms and stuff on that. You want to do that anytime you do any kind of like merging and stuff. Make sure you do, you don't have to center pivot, but at the very least you want to delete history. That's what this little button is right here. And then I usually freeze transforms, just keeps you from having any weirdness pop up. So, now we saw what happened when I, separated the object initially. You end up with all those different verts. Now if we do it with this one, and when it separates them, it creates a big group of them all, just so you know. So what we end up with this one is, oh, hey, look at that. Everything is pretty well, broken up the way we'd want it. You've got this nice section here. Yeah, you'll still have these little things. You can combine those if you need to. But for the most part, like the upper arm, all that, you end up with objects kind of being grouped together as a solo component, how they were built. Generally, you're going to have a few little bits and bobs, but it's a million times easier to deal with than this other version where it's just like weird single planes and things like that. So, I'm going to go ahead and do this other one. Alright. So, what you'll end up with is you'll end up with your new sectioned out mech in a group. Easy. Edit. Ungroup. I'm going to go ahead and freeze transforms, delete history, all that kind of stuff. Now you've got all your poly surfaces individually. So a shit ton of poly surfaces, but that's what it is. The next step is just simply grouping them up as you need them. So like I said, in MechWarrior 5, you want to have your primary components. You're going to have, upper arm, lower arm, forearm, whatever, thigh, calf, foot. So you want to make sure everything is broken up the way it needs to be in order for the engine to work. So we will take all this stuff here. Let me see. Okay, yeah. So some of these are solid objects which will need to be cut in order to work properly with the sort of center front. Left front torso, right front torso, left rear torso, that kind of thing. You'll notice with some of this stuff, it kind of already is there. I mean, it's not cut necessarily, but the positioning of the objects based on the torso, you can break it apart and, weld them together in such a way that it kind of creates that. So like, for instance, let's say I want right rear torso. So it'll be this, and I'm not gonna touch this bigger chunk here just yet because I'm gonna actually cut those up. I'll select that, I'll select this. I get all these little objects grabbed up. Now you can do this with a drag select if you want. Just gonna break things up that way. Up to you, whatever works best for you. But the idea is that you're going to be selecting all the objects that normally would make up that component section. You go to mesh and combine. And then I'll usually freeze transform and stuff after that. So now, that's your whole side there. But cut these. I am going to isolate them because that will make it easier to do. So, here's a big old chunky section that we need to break apart into its own individual, front right and front rear. There's a couple ways you can do it. Once you've isolated a selection, that way you can kind of see what you're working with. You can either do it by faces. I'm just right clicking and dragging to bring up the little menu, by the way. I'm going to go ahead and collapse these. So combine, now they're all a single component. Now I can go to face mode on the whole component rather than sitting there having to put up other stuff. And I'll go to the top view, drag out roughly about where I'd want things to be. Kind of check that and say, let's get rid of that parts there. I'm basically just checking to kind of see how it looks. See, it's not grabbing enough on the top. I'm going to go ahead and stretch it out a little more. Grab on that top. That side grab it. That's a little better. gonna kind of unselect some of these things. Because what I'm doing is I'm selecting faces. Yeah, I want to move that back. What I'm doing is I'm selecting faces that I'm then going to break away from the main object as their own component sections. And see, there's two ways you can do this. Depends on how easy it is, how well it's working out, or whether you're getting stuff kind of broken up the way you want. I will usually either just select faces like this and kind of pick which ones I want to try to get it as close to possible, or I will actually just do a cut right across all the faces. Yeah, I'm not going to get quite what I want. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the cut. Alright, I'm going to go in this view. You're going to hold shift, right click, go to multi-cut. Now this is going to bring up a little cutting tool. And let's say we put it right here. I'm going to hold shift and drag it out. It's going to give me a nice vertical lock. It should cut across the whole object. Looks like it did. Go back to face mode, select everything. There. So now you got this nice clean line. Kind of hard to see in this view. You can see it really clearly in this. Same thing here. Nice clean front right, front rear. So the way you work with that is now that you've cut it, you've got the faces selected, you go to mesh and separate. Oh, no, hold on. I messed up. It wasn't separate, it was extract. Edit mesh. Detach. That's what, not extract. So edit mesh, detach. Now it's detached. So what I'll do is object, you'll need to do a separate. I'm going to do all my delete history and everything on it. Now, when you select it all, now you get that nice section on its own. You'll do drag select, combine it back together, and then you'll do the opposite side. If you shift click, you can remove stuff. Combine, delete history, all that kind of stuff. There. Now I've got my front right torso and my rear right torso. Now I've got those extra pieces. I can select this. Now it's going to highlight all those other parts. I did not read that one. Grab that one real quick. Multi-cut. Edit mesh, hatch, object, mesh, separate. You can also do the control 1 to isolate in other views as well. You just hover over it and press control 1. Right, mesh combine. It's actually already done that way. Okay, cool. I'm gonna unisolate that stuff. Stop. Like these. Make sure you've got everything that's gonna go in the front right. You select all these little guys. Double check, look for any little sneaky bits like that. I'm gonna go ahead and leave all this for the center torso. You can make it as exact as you want. I don't generally go that crazy just because it's a whole lot of extra work to be super nitpicky about it. And honestly, nobody's gonna notice. So once you get all that stuff selected, you just combine again, delete all your history, and now you have a true, front right torso. So this right here is your actual front right torso you would have in game. Now we can pick all this back part and get it all set up too. Mesh, combine. So now you have your front right torso and your front rear torso, or your right rear torso. And with everything else, it's just pick your stuff. So there's the torso and the pelvis are the only sections that need to be cut that way. I mean, I 99% of the time. Maybe there's some crazy mech where you have to do some weird stuff with the arms, but most of the time it's just you cut those sections and that's it. Everything else is already there, so you'll want to select all your little arm pieces. Make sure you get everything that's going to go together. Anything else that's supposed to move with it? Mesh combine. Then you just highlight or drag out, deselect your upper arm. Mesh combine. Alright. So, same process, both sides. I'm not going to do all the different parts because this is just kind of give you an idea of what you're doing. You'll do the same thing here because you'll know sometimes it'll keep the cockpit as part of the upper torso or the center torso. You can do a separate on it. So there's a couple different ways you can do it. A lot of times with these, I like to just do it by face. So you go in and select all the faces, detach it, and all that. Alright. You'll want to make sure you name all your parts. Obviously, you see a whole bunch of random poly groups here, but it's like Viper, upper arm, right, Viper, forearm, right, Viper, torso, right, front. You want to make sure your naming conventions are in place because otherwise it makes it really difficult to figure out what you're messing with, and it's always a good practice to ensure that your naming conventions are as close to the vanilla format as possible, because if there's anything that auto detects based off of naming conventions and things like that, it'll save your ass. So right, rear. Obviously my naming conventions may not be accurate. I've messed with this stuff a little bit. So, I'm going to actually hide off everything else because it's not really that important. I should get it visually out of the way. Alright. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, the MWO mechs will actually come as that one out, so it's not grouped in. So, anywho, the MWO mechs will come as angled off this way. So you'll see that the vanilla mech is pointing out this way, and then tilted, easy, just go to your channel editor, rotate that 90 degrees, do all your freeze transforms and stuff, and that's it. You're good to go. Oh my god, that's not gonna work. Trying to ungroup stuff. It's being a little dumb. You'll notice that sometimes with Maya you'll have weird finicky bits where it just doesn't want to cooperate. Well, fine. I will ungroup everything. And then I will just regroup the stuff I want to regroup. There we go. Let's see. So in this case, I can see already pretty clearly that the cataphract skeleton is not going to work. Well, at least in this instance. So there's a couple of ways to do this. So let's say I'm going to have to put these things back in grouping. Alright, let me do this. I'm going to double group it. There we go. let's say I've got my cataphract, right? And I'm like, well, maybe it'll fit. So instead of scaling the skeleton down to try to make it fit the cataphract geometry, or the geometry for this thing, what you'll actually do is scale everything up. So there's something you might want to do is whenever you're doing a reset transform or a center pivot, it will center the pivot in the middle of all the geometry. When I'm doing these kind of scaling, usually it's better to move your pivot into the 0 space or the origin point in order to ensure that you're scaling vertically from the 0 rather than uniformly from a different point. It just makes things kind of stay together easier. If you move to one of your manipulators, so it doesn't matter, scale, whatever, and you hold X, you'll see it changes to a circle in the middle. That allows you to move your no, there it is. D, not X. Yeah. Anywho, press D. That'll switch to moving your manipulator around, and then you can hold X to snap to the grid points. And then just kind of drag it over here, get it zeroed out at the center. Alright, good. So, now when we scale up, it'll scale up properly without going, below the plane. So like I said, you're trying to get your legs primarily in a good center point. So in this case, it's close. Should be close enough to work, actually. You'll notice here that the feet aren't quite lined up. That may be an issue. Like I said, it's kind of a matter of you have to fiddle with it and see, your thighs are centered. Now, I'm primarily focused on from a side view, getting the proportions in the right place, because the front view, they're generally not going to be too far spread out. If they are, you need to consider that, but you just got to work with what you got to see how you can make it work. So in this case, we know the feet will be a little weird. We're going to let it slide just because obviously I'm not going to actually rig it all up and everything. But that's something you'll want to consider. The legs are not too bad. The arms are in pretty good place. So yeah, it should be alright to work with. You can obviously just, select the geometry and move it forward if need be to get everything really centered up. The geometry is just the visual representation. It doesn't matter. The skeleton is the thing that's important, and getting everything tied together with that. Geometry is just there to look pretty. Alright, so go ahead and hide that. So the way you would rig these is super simple. So first things first, I'm going to put those in. We're only going to be working on the right side. So when you're dealing with rigging, particularly in MechWarrior 5, we're going to be rigging for whole components. So when you would normally rig a skeleton to a mesh, a lot of times you're going to be doing it as like an organic character that's going to have, squash and stretch and flexing of geometry and stuff like that. As a machine, it's not going to have that. MechWarrior doesn't use it. You could theoretically use it, but you probably don't need to worry about it. You can try it if you want to, but I just would recommend, until you're fully comfortable doing it, just stick to a good, solid rig style. So, super easy. You're going to select your geometry you want to work with, and you're going to find your bone that you're going to work with. Like I said, if you're following the guide, you'll understand that you have two sets of a rigged SKM you need. You need one that's going to be rigged to the DM0 part. That is your baseline visual representation, and then you'll have a second one which is your 4-5 SKM. That's your SKM that's purely for the ragdoll physics and all that. That one is going to be rigged to the one that does not have a DM. So in this case, if we're doing the regular and we're rigging it to the upper arm, we're going to be rigging it to this one. You're going to hold control when you click. The reason you do that is so you don't select everything in the hierarchy. You only want to rig it to one bone. You don't want to rig it to all the bones of the hierarchy. So I would select the arm here individually, you can see it's just the arm. And if I hold shift and hit upper arm DM0, it selects everything in the hierarchy. Don't want that. So you're going to hold control, hit it, and it's just that one bone, which is what you're looking for. So anywho, if you're doing the regular SKM, it's going to this DM0. If you're doing the 4-5, it's going to go to this one up here, upper arm right. And same thing with all the other parts, so forearm right or forearm right DM0, elbow right, torso, left, rear. They're not necessarily right next to each other. Some are kind of weird to find, like the torso ones are kind of spread out. But same thing for everything. DM0 is your actual baseline. The 4-5, which is only for mechs, is going to be the one that's going to have the regular one. So let's do the DM0, upper arm right, DM0. We're going to make sure we're set to rigging. You'll go to skin and bind skin. We're going to hit the options button. And these are the options you're generally going to be looking for. And the reason is like I said, you're not going to be doing any kind of flex. So max influences, you're only going to want one, because you only want that one bone to affect that one piece of geometry purely. So when Maya rigs stuff, it does it in a decimal, 1.0 to 000. 1 being fully 100% influence and 0 being 0 influence, and then just a sliding scale between, represented as a black to white. White being 1.0 and black being 0. Since you're going to be doing a regular hard bind, you want to make sure it's just a single influence on that one object as is. That way it moves it, there's no flexing, there's no warping, it's just is what it is. I forget, I want to say, people are saying Blender had something like that. Like Blender, it's like you like group it to bind it or something. I don't remember exactly. I don't use Blender, so I really don't know 100% how it rigs. But in Maya, it's purely skin binding. So you're binding it to that skin so that when they move together. All right, so maintain max influence, remove unused, blah blah blah. Max influence is 1. Distance, interactive, keep that, all that. You can leave it the closest distance, and you're going to want to make sure bind to is set to selected joint. You don't want joint hierarchy because you don't want it influenced by any other bones. You only want it influenced by the single bone that you're selecting. So you hit selected joint, and then apply and close. Now this is applying those settings, so you could just continue to. You could just hit the regular bind skin. You don't have to pop up the options every time. So if we hit DM0 and we rotate it, see it's moving the bone, or it's moving the geometry all by itself, just like you want it. And then, I don't know, let's say clavicle right, we move it, it's moving the geometry so that your upper arm is bound. Now we do forearm right DM0, skin, bind skin, and again, everything is bound up nice and comfy. You also want to make sure you undo if you move anything, just to make sure that you're not altering the skeleton at all, because that breaks so much stuff. So if we do torso right front, let's see, torso right front, DM0, skin, bind, torso right rear, DM0, skin, bind. And if we move the torso twist around, everything's bound up, you're good to go. So you would just go through and do that to all the different parts that you created, and it would be rigged and ready to go. You can just go, like I said, I don't remember exactly the setup I had. It's in the guide. Definitely want to double check it, but I'm fairly sure it's going to be the root on the top, and then, I don't know, let's say this cataphract SKM is the one that I'm exporting. So let's say it's all rigged up and everything. So you'd want root above, cataphract SKM underneath it, not grouped together. So you see they're not grouped. You would then select both of them with a shift click. So click root, hold shift, click cataphract, file, export selection. Don't export all, only the selection. FBX. And then wherever you're going to go. A couple things you're going to want to do is make sure animation is disabled. You don't need to export any kind of animations. You want to make sure you don't have smooth. So I'm pretty sure the guide has it. I'll just show it on here just in case you need another version of it. So these are my export settings for the FBX. So smoothing groups are on. You want that. You don't want smooth mesh on. You don't want triangulate on. You don't need tangents. Binormals that was on because I was doing some school stuff. Let's see. Don't want animations, and that's pretty much it. Everything else is just kind of as is. I've been using FBX 2013. There's other versions depending on your Maya version you have, but I think it was 2013. I think I was having the best luck with. I want to say I was having some problems with Unreal, not properly reading some of the newer ones, but that's it. They'll type it out, export it, and then you'll be good to go to drag it into Unreal Engine. Now, when you're dealing with the actual damaged mesh itself, it's in the guide. I'm pretty sure I listed out, but a tip. So whenever you're like taking these different components and you're going to be exporting them out as a static mesh for the armor replacements and structure replacements and stuff, for the actual damage models, it's a little bit time consuming, but honestly I find that just exporting out the damage models from Unreal of the mech that you've got the vanilla mech you use the skeleton from, is the easiest bet, because as you can see, all these bones are not in any kind of like true neutral space. You know, some of them are tilted slightly different, they're off center, all that kind of stuff. It's like, if you're trying to guess all the rotations, it's going to be 1,000 times more work. So my recommendation would be like, okay, well, I don't know, I need the front right torso of this cataphract, so I would export that from the cataphract's base vanilla files, import that here. It'll be in the proper rotations and stuff that it needs, and just simply take your own front right torso and rotate it to match that and export that out. Make sure you do the freeze transforms and stuff. But that way you get your damage mesh rotations properly, because they're not bound. They're not skinned at all. They're just rotated and exported out. So that way you get it kind of done a little bit easier. You don't have to worry about it as much. I think that's pretty much it. Everything else is in the guide. I already explained to you the whole using the 4 or 5 things to fix some of the damage detection. Yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. Kind of see how it goes, but that should kind of give you a little visual example of what I mean when I'm talking about breaking up components and all that kind of stuff.